to review health and
I asked you that question because in reading your testimony, in which you put a great emphasis on the UN report guiding principles on business and human rights, you refer to, of the responsibilities there, that the second is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, which means that business enterprises should act with due diligence to avoid infringing on the rights of others and to address adverse impacts with which they are involved. Now, of course, one can ultimately respect human rights but do nothing about it. And so at the end of the day, I get concerned when I hear about the industry's unwillingness to join a more global standard so that regardless of whether it is Bangladesh today or some other place tomorrow, we have a global standard that we don't have a race to the bottom. And I think Rana Plaza shows the limits of individual corporate responsibility because because multiple brands very often source from the same factory. So if you have a serious free rider problem if different retailers are approaching standards differently, and that leads some to say, well, unless it's everybody else, I'm not going to live to a higher standard unless they have a corporate ethos that says I want to live to a higher standard, even though it may make me somewhat less competitive than the others. And so I read your comments about liability, and I hope that the industry understands that while I understand their need to protect themselves legally, there can be no success at the end of the day. No one will want to wear a piece of clothing made in Bangladesh if it's on the blood of workers. Those brands will go down the tube. It's only a question of time. Only a question of time. So I hope the industry gets their act together, and sooner rather than later, because it has been willing. These are not all of a sudden. Rana Plaza is only a dramatization, unfortunately, of a great tragedy. But it's not because this hasn't existed. The fact that there have been, pending USTR, and I just finished with the USTR nominee upstairs, the fact that that's been languishing 6 years gives us an example of how everybody turns a blind eye until something happens. I can assure you, something is going to happen here. And as I've told industries before, in good faith, either get your act together and establish standards, or find yourself with standards you may not pay for. And I hope that's the message that you will take back to the industry today.
Senator, thank you for those comments. I think you are spot on. It has become an extremely important issue for all stakeholders, including the industry, and they will take those comments of yours to heart.
Ms. Drake, I don't have any questions for you simply because I largely agree with your testimony. But if in the last few seconds here you've heard anything that you want to have a view for the record espoused, I'm happy to give you this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I found it interesting, if we take the industry at its word that, its corporate social responsibility focus right now, health and safety is a priority. These firms, and many of them, Walmart in particular, has been operating in Bangladesh since the 90s. Mr. Lubbe mentioned the many systemic problems that the firms are aware of in Bangladesh, whether it's factories being built on unstable ground, whether it's an inconsistent electricity supply, water supply. And these problems, and as I testified to earlier, the history of building collapses, fire collapses, it's not, didn't start with Tazreen. It goes back many, many years. So if they've known about this, and if they care about this, there's a true disconnect. Is it one of these situations where doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is not a prime example of corporate management? We've got a report from the AFL-CIO. I cited it in my testimony, and there's a link, but I can leave copies here today for Mr. Kane, Mr. Menendez, if you would like to have these. And it explains that these voluntary programs that can be eliminated at any moment as soon as the brands think that the spotlight is off of them or that they've already contributed enough money to factory safety or whatever it is, they simply don't work. If a social auditor comes into a factory like Rana Plaza and finds that it is in fact unstable, the workers in the voluntary programs are never notified. They're not part of the system. You want to talk about unilateral, the accord, we disagree strongly with the statement that industrial set it out unilaterally. The accord was being negotiated for more than a year, and various brands had taken a look. American brands, Walmart and Gap, were there at the beginning and chose not to deal with it in 2012 and then chose not to deal with it again. But it was, in our view, a true negotiation and very different than these plans, and that's what we're really afraid of, is that this new alternative plan with the Bipartisan Policy Center, it sounds good, but if it ends up with more of these corporate-directed, socially responsible, but not giving workers the power to speak up for themselves and be monitors of their own health and safety, it's simply not going to work. And if, in fact, it somehow does create a standard that's binding and enforceable, that's terrific, but then you have workers who in the morning are working for Walmart and in the afternoon are working for H&M, and they have to remember which is the standard and what applies and what they can speak up about and what they're not allowed to speak up about. That's not really a helpful situation when you're talking about 4 million workers who are impoverished, many of whom are illiterate, and they have to keep track of what their rights are. So, and I also wanted to point out the irony. The firms are concerned about arbitration under the accord, and this might be the only time where you get a witness from the business side that doesn't want arbitration and a witness from the labor side that says, no, we'd like to have arbitration here. So we think that the accord, we've read it, it doesn't create a cause of action in U.S. courts. The Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, these create causes of action in American courts. It doesn't. It's not vague. There are things that are going to be worked out during this implementation period, but with the recent decision on the Alien Tort Claims Act, we just don't view it as really being a threat to these brands, and neither, in fact, do Abercrombie & Fitch and Sean John and PVH. And H&M, which is the European company that operates in the United States, or these other companies that have signed it. And we appreciate your support for it, and just, continue to ask you to help us in our efforts to push these brands to sign, because as you've said, they will be the reputational losers if they don't. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, you've made ample use of the opportunity I gave you. So with that, let me turn to Senator Kane. I'm going to ask Senator Kane if you would close out the hearing, because I have a meeting. We'll keep the record open until Friday for questions. And my thanks to both of you. I look forward to working with both of you as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one last question.